Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about two games in a little compare and contrast style. The effects and total analysis of Castlevania Symphony of the Night at this point is kind of not even worth talking about. It spawned a whole genre of video games alongside Super Metroid that are still immensely popular and being made today. But I feel like what doesn't really get talked about is a lot of the games that came after it. So what I want to talk about today is the first two games that came out for the Game Boy Advanced in the Castlevania series, that being Castlevania Circle of the Moon and Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. Now, these two games form an interesting comparison because they're both attempts to adapt the Metroidvania, specifically the Symphony of the Night gameplay style, for a Belmont main character. And without spoiling too much, one of them is an incredible success and one of them is kind of a failure. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Castlevania Circle of the Moon was a launch title for the GBA, coming out with it in 2001. And actually, I think a lot of the issues that I had playing with the game can be chalked up to it being such an early Game Boy Advance title, as well as none of the original team from Symphony of the Night would go on to work on this game, a fact that would be changed going forward. Instead, this game was developed by the same team that had worked on Castlevania 64 and the prequel expansion release Castlevania 64 Legacy of Darkness. One of the things that's strange about this game is everything feels wrong. It feels like it was made by a group of people who saw somebody play Castlevania Symphony of the Night, or maybe had the game explained to them without ever playing it themselves and knowing what was right and wrong about it, and what was so revolutionary for the time. But let's get down to basics. From the outside, this appears to be a pretty standard entry in what would become a fairly familiar Metroidvania format. Though there are no Belmonts in sight, you do control a whip-wielding hero who traverses Dracula's castle on a quest to kill him. Killing monsters will yield you experience points, which work towards leveling up and increasing your stats. Also, as introduced in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, there is an equipment system where Hugh can equip different armor pieces that will affect his defense stat as well as various other ones. Also, returning from Castlevania Symphony of the Night is the appearance of single-use items. These are either healing items or status effect recovery items, and can be found dropped off of enemies throughout the game. Sub-weapons, a series mainstay, also make a return here, where you have access to the knife, the axe, the cross or boomerang, the stopwatch, and holy water. The completely unique element introduced for Circle of the Moon is the DDS, or Dual Deck System. This refers to the fact that you have a deck of action cards and a deck of attribute cards. The action cards are themed after Roman gods, whereas the attribute cards are themed after mythological creatures. In the main menu, you can make combinations of cards to produce certain effects that either increase your stats, change your weapon's elemental attack, change the expression of your weapon altogether, and in some cases summon monsters to help fight for you, or produce item crush effects, similar to the way that Richter Belmont can in Symphony of the Night and Dracula X. An interesting twist on this system, though, is it won't tell you what the combination does right off the bat. You must first activate it, and then meet the certain condition that produces the effect. For some abilities, this is easy because they are just a change in the attack or increase in a stat. Other ones have certain inputs that you have to do to activate them, which makes it a lot harder. Now with the basics out of the way, let's talk about the actual game. I mentioned it earlier before, but this game really plays like a Castlevania game that was created by somebody who didn't really understand what made Symphony of the Night special. You can see this as early as when you get control of Nathan and start to move him around. See, the problem is Nathan controls like a traditional Belmont protagonist, which is to say that his movements are slow and deliberate. In early Castlevania games, challenges were designed around this, where enemies would move in a predictable or semi-predictable pattern, and you would have to gauge your jump and attack times to meet that pattern. It was difficult, but it was doable because you could read them. However, this doesn't really seem to be the case in Circle of the Moon. In Circle of the Moon, a lot of enemies are designed to be much more agile and less predictable. They feel like enemies that belong in Symphony of the Night. But since we don't have Agile Alucard as our protagonist, dealing with these foes are much more difficult. The movement speed is vaguely rectified by the fact that you can slide, and the first relic that you get allows you to run, but then you just spend the whole game double tapping to run everywhere and wondering why this wasn't just a function built into your protagonist at the beginning. This speaks to a much larger issue with the relics in this game in general. Half of the relics that you get are designed specifically for dealing with arbitrary progress gating methods, destructible blocks of stone that you can tackle through, heavy wooden crates that need to be pushed out of the way, a poison river that needs to be cleansed, and what's essentially just the key to the final boss room. That means that the only abilities that you get throughout the game are pretty standard ones and don't really add much to the game other than the fact that they are genre staples, that being the double jump and the super jump. You do also get a wall kick ability, but I never saw this used in a way that might make it easier to fight a boss or saw any application for it other than just getting to places that you couldn't get to before. One of the big innovations that Symphony of the Night made was taking money pickups and changing them into actual collectible currency instead of just using them to up your point value. This currency, once collected, could be spent in a store where you could buy consumable items, equipment, and other accessories. For some reason, though, this system is completely gone in Circle of the Moon. The only way that you'll pick up more items is by killing enemies and getting them off of rare drops. Unfortunately, this also applies to picking up DDS cards, with the exception of one or two that I think are destined to drop at the beginning of the game to introduce the system to you. Every other subsequent card that you get has to be a rare drop, which means that depending on what your luck is and what your drop rates are, you could potentially never encounter another card in the whole game. Never mind the fact that for most of the game you'll be picking up basically useless potions, and again, if you ever want to stock up on curative or recovery items, you have to spend that time grinding. Same thing goes for equipment. Any equipment that you pick up, with a few exceptions, is all through random drops. So if you're not getting better equipment, then you're not getting better other than your stat increases. This also means that any armor picked up or accessories picked up in excess of what you can equip, which is one at a time, is absolutely useless because you have nobody to sell them back to. At the end of the game, I had maximum stacks of a lot of low-tier armor, but absolutely no healing potions at all. Similarly, though it plays in familiar territory for a Castlevania story, the articulation of it is slightly off as well. We have all of the normal components, somebody trying to resurrect Dracula, you progressing through the castle and encountering plot points at certain intervals, all the while chasing a best friend who may or may not be a bad guy, ultimately culminating in a battle to the death with Dracula. There are some interesting omissions that appear in this game only. Most notably, the replacing of the Belmont clan with generic vampire hunters and the unexplained disappearance of the vampire killer Whip. This sort of disconnect from the overall series timeline is the main reason that most people think that Circle of the Moon was removed from the canon of the whole series. One of the things that I've started to notice as I grow older is how games do or don't incentivize exploration. An aspect of Symphony of the Night that I don't think really gets discussed much is how well it incentivizes exploration. There's always something interesting to find, a new item to pick up, a new piece of armor. Health point max-ups or heart max-ups are always seeming to be waiting around the corner. Again though, in Circle of the Moon, bafflingly, the only thing that you ever find in secret rooms are HP ups, MP ups, or heart max ups. They don't sprinkle around items, equipment, or DDS cards in the hidden areas, which I think would go a long way to make those much more interesting to find and experience. One of the key components of a Metroidvania is it should be fun to explore. It is primarily an exploration-based game type. But if you're not incentivizing and putting good rewards for people to poke around and find, then that incentive to explore just goes away and it feels like you're just kind of trekking through the castle to go through it. Which is really too bad, because I see a lot of potential in this game, and certainly it was impressive when it came out. To be fair, we can look at it in hindsight and say that it doesn't quite capture the Metroidvania genre, but it's important to remember that the Metroidvania genre as a whole didn't really exist at the time, even though Symphony of the Night and Super Metroid had already come out and are pretty good examples of that genre. One thing that I will say in its favor is that the music is all really pretty good. The Game Boy Advance is pretty notorious for having a muddy sound chip that doesn't often produce very good music. The composers here did a good job of utilizing that sound chip and making the most of it. Also, as a fun little Easter egg, a lot of the music in this game is rearrangements of previous songs from the series, so it provides a little Easter egg for returning fans. Though Castlevania Circle of the Moon was a commercial and critical success, it was eventually removed from the canon by Koji Igarashi, longtime series director, who would get his own crack at a Castlevania game in 2002's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. There are a couple of interviews that he gave at the time where he stated that he was unsatisfied with Circle of the Moon, and Harmony of Dissonance was created specifically with a mind towards correcting those issues that he felt were in the first attempt. Overall, though I'm glad for the revisit, I think that Castlevania Circle of the Moon, while it might have been the best product that it could be for the time, is not really worth a revisit. It plays more frustratingly than I think is really worth it, and later entries in the series will do what it tries to do much better. In the same tradition of it being a Castlevania game that just doesn't quite get it right, Castlevania Circle of the Moon does have replayability modes that are unlocked after you beat the main game. Apparently, according to the Wikipedia page, your rival throughout the game, Hugh, was showed as a playable character in the demo originally shown for it, but that didn't make it into the full game. What we got instead were different modes that you could replay as. These are passwords that you can put in the name select at the beginning of the game that affects your starting stats and some of how you play the game. While these are interesting ideas, they're not really compelling enough to make me want to revisit the game in the same way that playing as Richter is in Symphony of the Night or Maria, or having different modes for other characters that will appear later on in the series. Overall, I give it 3 Draculas out of 5. Certainly not the best that the series could be, but not as frustrating as the series could be as well. Mostly just a mediocre and middling title that doesn't really bear any revisits. As previously mentioned, Koji Igarashi specifically worked on and tried to fix things that he felt like were issues with Castlevania Circle of the Moon in order to make Harmony of Dissonance more in line with the success that he found in Symphony of the Night. And right from the start, you can really see the difference between the two games. The opening text crawl wastes no time in establishing both this game's place in the timeline and its relation to a previous game, mentioning right up front both Belmonts and Dracula. I'm not sure that you can quite grasp it just by looking at the footage, but the difference in the way that Juste Belmont controls versus Nathan Graves controls is immense. Automatically you can see that he has the dash move present in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, as well as overall just moving faster and controlling more fluidly. Our equipment system returns, this time with a slot to modify your whip, a designated slot for your body armor, and 3 undesignated slots that can either be filled with a helmet, boots, or an accessory. Also, thankfully, our merchant returns, and while he's not as centrally located and easy to get to as in Symphony of the Night or some of the later Castlevania installments, he will sell you curative items and body armor, as well as buy items off you if you have any extras. One of the most notable things to me in this game is how much of a step up in quality of graphics there are. One of the major criticisms of Circle of the Moon when it came out is that since the original Game Boy Advance models didn't have a backlit screen, it was incredibly hard to play because the graphics were so dark anyway. Now, on modern means of playing it, you don't really see that, but it was a big issue when it originally released. And you can tell that going forward, Castlevania games were designed with this criticism in mind. Most notably, you can see that everything is much more brightly colored, and Juste himself has a blue outline that I'm sure was put there to keep him from fading into the background too much if you were playing on an older Game Boy Advance system. Replacing the DSS system from Circle of the Moon as the unique mechanic in this game, Harmony of Dissonance instead introduces the spellbook system. Scattered throughout the world, you will come across various elemental spellbooks, which can be equipped and activated to modify sub-weapons and produce a different effect based on what spellbook is equipped. This is generally a pretty cool system, and I appreciate it more than the DSS system. Even if it is a little bit less varied than the DSS system was, it is much more accessible. I didn't go out of my way too much to explore Castle more than I needed to, but by the end of the game I had found 3 of the 5 available spellbooks. My only real gripe with it as it's presented is that in order to toggle on and off spellbooks, you have to go into the menu to change them. Unfortunately, since the Game Boy Advance didn't have very many buttons on it, there was no easy way to toggle it on and off. And in general, I found that, as is the case with most Castlevania games, that the boomerang sub-weapon is so much better than any of the modifications that I ended up just using it default instead of playing around with spellbooks. While in general I found the playthrough to be a little bit more straightforward with less arbitrary progress gates, I will say that there's some strange mechanics that go on with the teleporters in this game. Initially when you run into them, they seem to be just like the teleporters from any other Metroidvania where they move you from one spot to another. However, once you get to the point in the game where you invert the castle and you essentially have to go back through a B-side version of the castle, you learn that these teleporters actually move you into different sides of the castle from one to the other. So the first teleporter that you encounter moves you from Castle A in a specific destination to Castle B in a specific destination. But once you're past the half-point mark, you also find teleporters that just flop you from A side to B side in the exact same location. Once I understood what was going on, it was pretty easy to navigate again, but understanding it initially and figuring out how to get from one area to another got pretty confusing for a while there. I know I mentioned it and in fact completely broke it out into a separate video, which I'm sure you can watch here. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance is one of the first Castlevania games I feel to be really heavily referential to previous entries in the series. Though obviously there is a continuity of enemy and bosses across the whole series, Harmony of Dissonance specifically makes references to older games in a way that doesn't really happen except for maybe outside of Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And similarly to Symphony of the Night, Harmony of Dissonance also has a midway point where it seems like the game might be wrapping up, and you find that there is actually another half of a castle to explore, although not bisected in the same way that Symphony of the Night was, because you've already explored chunks of the B-side castle without knowing it. I also touch on this in the reference video, but this game also brings back multiple endings, where there are 3 different endings, a very bad, a kind of good, and best ending that can be achieved by defeating the final boss at certain points or during certain conditions. And finally, in terms of replayability, this game also brings back adding extra playable characters. Not only is it the first Castlevania game to add a boss rush mode, something that will appear in later handheld entries, but it also adds in the ability to play as your rival character, Maxim, for a playthrough of the castle that plays similarly to how Richter's playthrough of Symphony of the Night does. This game also fixes Circle of the Moon's exploration problem, where now back again, besides finding HP ups and heart max ups, also scattered around the world are items, equipment, and spellbooks for you to find, as well as collectibles that you can deposit in a specific room in the castle for a fun little added collection bonus. Harmony of Dissonance isn't without its flaws, but I think overall it's a much better and more playable entry into the Castlevania series than Circle of the Moon is. Even though it's not a great game, I appreciate its existence, specifically because almost everything in Harmony of Dissonance was created as a reaction to Circle of the Moon and the way it played and the way it was received. And without that existing in the first place, Harmony of Dissonance could easily have been a completely different game. Well, thank you for joining me. As always, I hope you found this interesting or informative. If you like this video, please do all of the YouTube engagement stuff. Hit the thing, ring the thing, press the thing. Comment down below. Let me know what your favorite Castlevania game is. Are you a fan of Retrovania or the Metroidvania installments? I love you all.